Hello, and welcome to another Seth book. I'm Poetic Heretic, coming to you live from a newly upgraded to Windows 10 at long last PC. So this is my first stream after having upgraded to Windows 10, so that might be a bit experimental, but I already did a test stream, and I think everything is working as it should, but I guess we'll find out. And yes, this is another Seth stream, continuing with The Unknown Reality, Volume 2, a Seth book by Jane Roberts. As usual, I will be both reading and commenting on the material. And it should be a very good time. A very good time. Okay, the audio is working. So I tried, by the way, while I get things set up here, because I switched to Google Chrome with Windows 10 for various reasons, I tried streaming using that, but surprisingly, the results were not so good. While Google Chrome seems to be better in almost every other way than the browser that I'm using now and have been using for some time, before upgrading, whenever I try to stream with it, it like zooms in artificially, the quality gets lowered and it is all around not good.
Okay, everyone. After a life-changing night with my wife, Karen.
That was an advertisement, if you can't tell. Or let's just start turning the volume down completely when I go to load this in this way. Okay, well, that should suffice. But anyway, yes, so I switched back to the other browser, and it appears to be streaming as normal. So upgrading to Windows 10 did not fix that little issue. But anyway, okay, all right, without further ado, let us begin. Session 739, February 24th, 1975, 9:25 p.m. Monday. And it is currently 9:22 p.m. on Monday, as I am beginning this now. On Friday, February 21st, Jane and I not only saw the Hill House from the inside for the first time, but decided to buy it. We made up our minds quite effortlessly while being taken through it by a real estate agent. Of course, we knew what Seth had suggested during last Wednesday's session, and his advice was valuable. At the same time, we'd been strongly inclined to make the purchase after looking at the house anew that Wednesday afternoon. At the realtor's office 2 days later, then, we signed the initial papers leading to the formal purchase, which will be consummated in a couple of weeks or so. As I wrote at the start of the 736th session, we first encountered the Hill House on February 4th, on just our second day of searching. A period of gestation lasting well over 2 weeks had to follow, though, before we understood what we'd seen. During that time, we investigated perhaps 35 other places. Footnote. I want to note here that at the same time Jane and I decided to buy the Hill House, we learned that the house next door to the west would soon be for sale. Because of a job transfer, its owner would be moving with his family to California this summer. No for sale sign had yet been set up in the front yard. Although Jane and I liked the place well enough, we had no doubt that the Hill House was the one for us. Our own plans to relocate, however, plus those of the family next door, whom we'll never get to know, reminded me of the material Seth gave at 11:25 for the 737th session, to the effect that any important decision we make organizes the patterns of probability set into motion. Quote, "This should be obvious. Unconsciously, then, the movers are in league with each other. There are sympathetic probabilities set up." End quote. So I said to Jane, not only are we stirring things up by moving out of the apartment house, but we're entering a situation where we will be staying put while others move away. Obvious, but intriguing. We'll be joining the present residents of the Hill neighborhood in forming a newer psychic and psychological entity than the one that existed before we arrived. Yet the full picture of our moving should include not only the myriad probabilities growing out of our own actions, but all of the probable developments involving that house next door. Whatever happens, whatever happenings take place there, which will help create, are bound to have their effects upon us. If one wanted to outline an event such as our moving from an arbitrary beginning to an arbitrary end, I added, it could be from the time we first looked at Mr. Markle's house in Sayre in April 1974 to sometime in the summer of 1975, when we think the situation next door will be resolved with the arrival of quote-unquote new people. It'll be interesting to see what, if any, house connections develop. End of footnote. These notes give me a chance to hint at another in the series of quote-unquote house connections that Jane and I have become so much aware of this month. For there is a close professional relationship between the owner of the Foster Avenue house and the real estate agency through which we're buying the house on the hill. Jane and I had heard of this association in a remote way, but it had no meaning for us until we committed ourselves to the Hill House. The agency concerned is but one of many we'd contacted. Yet also involved is our friend Debbie, who works for another real estate firm, and who had first called our attention to the Hill House. There are more intertwinings here, including some art elements, than is necessary to describe, but studying just this one complex house connection, then seeing how it combines with some of the others we've become conscious of, leaves Jane and me more than a little bemused by this interlocking reality we're creating. Footnote. Before I read this footnote, I'm taking a drink of tea. Or a sip of tea. Here's another house connection, one that developed last Thursday, the day after the 738th session was held. In the 737th session, after 11:55, Seth mentioned the quote-unquote other dentist who lived and worked around the corner from the apartment house Jane and I moved into in 1960 upon our arrival in Elmira. We soon became acquainted with him and his family on a very casual basis, since the back of his property abuts the west yard of the apartment house. Several years ago, our medical friend moved to a more residential area in Elmira, just where we didn't know, but kept his offices in his original home. Then on Thursday, we learned that he'd bought the place across the street from the Hill House. The family still lives there. We've also discovered that several other professional people who live near the Hill House maintain offices in the old near downtown neighborhood surrounding the apartment house. End of footnote. You know what? Before the main part of the session officially begins, I think I'm going to actually share this broadcast to Twitter after all. I wasn't going to originally, but now I think why the hell not? See if we can liven things up in here a little bit. Don't get your hopes up, though. That was meant to sound more ironic than it came out. It's like, don't get your hopes up, though, because my Seth streams are the least popular of my streams. Because not many people are interested in this material for some reason, but oh well. And yes, I'm doing it from my phone right now because, I don't know, I just feel like it. Live with more of the fuck is wrong with this thing? Hang on. Unknown reality. All right, we'll just say that. Let me just make sure real quick that that posted. And yes, it did. Good. Now, let us continue. In tonight's relatively brief session, Seth discussed our house adventures in quite a personal way, yet also passed along some related concepts of a more general nature. I deleted certain portions of his material about us while leaving other parts for presentation here, since they do extend his recent work for unknown reality. I think the words work and for there were not supposed to be in regular text, but were also supposed to be italicized. Fascinating, but anyway. Now, good evening. Good evening, Seth. This is not dictation. Once you made up your minds to, you found your house with characteristic swiftness, let me add, and you avoided several pitfalls. Rupert was correct. The picture of you, taken on the hill in the front yard by a friend, portrays you as far as your stance toward the hill house and land is concerned. Rupert was never athletically inclined, but always loved nature. The house and the grounds will allow you to pick up on old feelings that he had discarded, renewing to some extent a quote-unquote fresh air image that he once found natural. The Hill House neighborhood is composed of a rather beneficial balance. No particular family of consciousness predominates. Instead, a love of woods and trees transcends such classifications. The area has brought together diverse kinds of people, united by love of nature, some airy spaces, and some privacy. The people are also achievers of one kind or another, and while your goals may be different, you appreciate the fact that they are trying to do something with their lives. Many are aware of their limitations. Many dabble in the arts. Some are patrons of the arts. They possess a great curiosity about artists, writers, or others who have chosen a different route and achieved in that fashion. They needed you there. This does not mean that some of your characteristics may not seem as strange to them as some of theirs may seem to you. Pause at 9:45. Quite simply, few of them have known people who have devoted themselves to their art. They have only met them at receptions, with amusement. They have an almost childlike wonder and curiosity about such matters, and will actually give you as much privacy as you want. Your psychic work will also help them question the values of their lives. In any case, barriers will drop on both sides. Many of the children are grown, and the adults have more time to think and ponder. They also need to see other lifestyles. The mixture of families of consciousness allows you also to take a close look at the ways in which these tendencies merge to form communities. You are not moving into a closed psychic area, then, where everyone sees the world as you do, even generally speaking, nor should you. For you, Joseph, as Seth calls me, the place is reminiscent. You are also presented, whether you know it or not, with certain artistic challenges that the landscape itself will provide, and that you have chosen. I mentioned that the air was cleaner on the hill. You will also have another kind of freedom. Your psychic and other creative work will be easier simply because you will not have others so close to contend with in terms of thought patterns. Footnote. I found Seth's statement about contending with the thought patterns of others a particularly apropos one, since Jane and I have lived in apartment houses for many years and are only now preparing to give up that kind of life. A question: how does that steady psychic exchange affect all of those who work and or live in high-rise complexes, for instance? End of footnote. That brings up an interesting point. That's something I've thought of occasionally about the area that I live in, and I don't know, the sort of weird mix of people around here. I thought, I wonder what effect on me the sort of strange psychic mixture of the people who live around here might be having on me. it's a bit difficult to generalize, but I think from what I've observed of those who also live in this location, there are some that are respectable and others that are, well, not so much. But I've also been well aware for a long time that my particular kind of consciousness is likely far different from most, if not all, of theirs. And so I almost feel this this sense of having to really stand my ground, like the Seven of Wands card in tarot, for example, like holding a fixed position and not give in to the sort of garbage psychic influences of the other residents in this region. Again, even though some of them, at least, are, from what I can see, very respected people. They are well respected, ladies and gentlemen. But that doesn't mean that I still don't have to stand my ground, because similar to how you tend to become like the people that you spend the most time with, you also be influenced by the people that you are physically around the most, even if you have zero interaction with them, because of the overall psychic energy that is essentially permeating the general area. It's a bit hard to explain. We all live in basically like a sea of energy, I guess you could say. We all live in a sea of energy, basically. And now verbatim. The fireplace in the Hill House is advantageous, as the one in the house on Foster Avenue would have been, simply in that the open hearth represents an inner source of strength and stability. The open flame, the source of cave heat, is evocative and represents a closeness with the origins of light and life. Now, an open fire elicits certain responses from the cells that, for instance, a furnace does not. Footnote. Seth's material here reminded me of a remark he made in the 504th session, which is presented in the appendix of the Seth material. He was discussing the perceptions of the fetus as mediated by electromagnetic energy units. Quote, cells are not just responsive to light because this is the order of things, but because an emotional desire to perceive light is present. End quote. End of footnote. The effect of the light plus the warmth on the skin is underlined extremely healing. Oh my. People sit by a fireplace in wintertime because it is unconsciously recognized that recuperative and therapeutic results occur. Simply put, the cells respond to firelight in underlined somewhat the same manner that flowers do to sunlight. The stimulation is much more than skin deep, however, and an open fire underlined is cleansing. It even helps clear the blood. That's very interesting. Almost reminds me also of the purification through spiritual fire of the Eon and Judgment card in various tarot decks. Some decks is known as the Eon, like the Crowley Thoth, and others it's known as the Judgment card. I think in most it's known as the Judgment card. Interesting. Makes me wish I had a fire in my house, or a fireplace, I guess. I was around a few fires a number of years ago, and they did seem to have a very sort of calming, therapeutic effect, but I was also in the midst of like, I don't know, what can we say, like emotional psychic vampires at the time and shit like that. So I don't know how therapeutic the overall experience was, but I think the fire at least helped. Cavemen recognize this. I'm not suggesting that you use your fireplace instead of the furnace. I am saying that in wintertime there are definite health value effects to be felt when you sit in front of an open fire. 2 evenings a week would be quite effective. The proximity of so many trees also has underlined considerable health value, and to those doing psychic or other creative work, the effects are particularly conducive to a peaceful state of mind. You know what I just thought of, though, going back to the fire thing? I wonder if sitting in front of an open fire in a fireplace is beneficial, then is too sitting in candlelight, having the flames of a few candles lit, also similarly beneficial. Maybe that's why anytime I've ever lit a candle, I just tend to feel so good. I feel so much better. I would do my live streams with candles lit in here, in fact, if I could, which the only reason I'm not lighting candles all the time is because they cost money, of course. So my financial situation would have to improve if I was going to light any more candles anytime soon, but who knows, maybe that'll improve. Maybe the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January will be good for me. Anyway, let's continue. Trees are great users and yet conservators, that's a weird word, conservators of energy, and they automatically provide much vitality to areas in which they are plentiful. This is physically obvious in scientific terms. Besides that, however, the consciousnesses of trees are remarkably kind and enduring. Footnote. See Seth's discussion of tree consciousness in session 727. Note 7 for that session contains excerpts from his tree data in the 18th session for January 22nd, 1964, and in the 453rd session for December 4th, 1968. Here's some more related material from the 18th session. Quote, as your body senses temperature changes, so it also senses the psychic charge not only of other humans, or of other human beings, but also, believe it or not, of animals and to a lesser extent, of plants and vegetative matter. Your tree builds up a composite of sensations of this sort, sensing not the physical dimensions of a material object, whatever it is, but the vital psychic formation within and about it. The table beside Rupert senses him even as Rupert senses the table. The abilities of the tree are latent in man as, dear Joseph, are the abilities of man latent in the tree. End quote. End of footnote. Now you think of dogs as friends of man, and you personify gods in human terms. You think of them sometimes as guardians. In those terms, now, trees are also guardians. They are attached to the people they know. You cannot put a leash on them and walk them around the block, yet trees form a protective barrier about, say, a home or a neighborhood. They are actively underlined concerned. They have personalities, certainly to the same extent that dogs do, yet of an entirely different nature. They respond to you. The trees in that hill house neighborhood then are particularly friendly, strong, and protective, and they will help renew your energies. The air there is drier in a certain way. Now, ocean air is wet, but it is healthy. River air is wet, but it may be healthy, underlined, or unhealthy, according to the nature of the river, the land, and the attitude of the people. After the flood in your area, the river air is felt to be a threat, and to many it is therefore unhealthy. At some time, I will give you information discussing the reasons why some people, after being flooded in one location, then move to another equally threatening environment. The hill property represents a certain kind of security, then financial, spiritual, and artistic, but an open security in which there is relative privacy without an overemphasis upon secrecy, which is something different. Take your break. 10:17 p.m. Jane's delivery had been very steady. She told me now, however, that she was entering a relaxed state. Her very pleasant situation continued to deepen. so we decided to let the rest of the session go. The flood referred to by Seth took place on June 23rd, 1972. It was caused by the massive tropical storm Agnes and devastated many areas in New York, among other eastern states. Low-lying portions of Elmira were much damaged. Jane and I were involved in it, and Seth discussed our experiences in personal reality. See Chapter 1, for instance. Now, this is the right time to refer the reader to Appendix 27, which contains Sue Watkins' account of her past life involvement with the Grunarg family of consciousness. All right, so that's it for that session. And Appendix 27 we'll get to when we get to eventually in this book. Hey there, Ryan. Hearty quack to you as well, sir. Wow, so isn't that interesting what Seth was talking about there, saying that trees have personalities and trees have this like kind, gentle, strong, protective energy. Makes me really hope that the trees around here, or like around my house, continue to be there because sometimes they get to be too big and then they have to be trimmed or cut down entirely. Like one was a couple of years ago, and I felt kind of bad for it, but I guess it had to be done. Duck army assemble. Yeah, there you go. It's like the collective consciousness of ducks. Nice hoodie there, Mr. Poetic. Thank you. I mean, I don't know if it's technically a hoodie because there's no hood on it, but yeah, it's getting colder here in these parts by about this time of year, so I'm having to break out the warmer clothing, the long sleeve stuff. So that's what we have. But anyway, we are now about to continue with the next session. The last one was pretty short. Apparently this one will take 42 minutes to get through. All right, here we go. Session 740, February 26th, 1975, 9:35 p.m., Wednesday. In ESP class last night, Jane told all of her loyal students, some of whom have been with her almost from the time she began holding such meetings in the summer of 1967, that class was suspended until we'd moved into the Hill House and settled down a bit, however long that might take. Jane and I were inside, quote-unquote, our Hill House for only the second time this afternoon. Again, we were accompanied by a real estate agent. Because of insurance regulations, we're not allowed to have a key to the place yet, although we've been told that this dilemma will be resolved very soon. In the meantime, I've begun what seems to be an awesome task, packing many of our possessions into an endless series of cartons that had once held things like wine, mayonnaise, cereal, pipe fittings, and so forth. Just before the session, Jane began to edge into an altered state of consciousness other than the one she uses for her quote-unquote Seth trance, as she put it. For a few moments, she sat quietly with her eyes closed. She felt, quote, the idea, mentally, of something shaped like a television screen, end quote, off to her right. By now, I was writing down what I could. Quote, and now it's coming closer. I don't know what it is, or what it has to do with the session, if anything, end quote. She paused, then resumed in the past tense. It came up fairly close to me. I walked through it and down a long chute. There were coils in there. They did things with me, healing things, then dropped me back in my chair. I had the feeling that Seth was in this chute or tunnel, in miniature, and that he looked like he does in your portrait of him, only in full length. End quote. Footnote. Nice colored sweater. Thank you. I appreciate it, regardless of what you would call this that I'm wearing. See the picture section in Prentice Hall's edition of the Seth material for a cropped black and white reproduction of my oil portrait of Seth, quote, in the form in which he chose to appear to Rob, end quote, as Jane wrote in chapter 8 of that book. Seth first announced his presence by name in the 4th session for December 8th, 1963. I painted him in 1966. End of footnote. Back to the present. Oh, he comes forward, then retreats, oscillating real fast. But in some way the Seth thing in this is in the background. Now he's turning around, this miniature Seth. He's walking away, out of the chute and into this great big Seth, who's like a statue. Oh my. Then in the eyes of this Seth, there are two little Seths looking out. Both of these images are like your portrait. Now they climb out of the eyes. With their bodies, they make a garland around the big Seth's head. They sit on it back to back like a pair of bookends. End quote. Pause, eyes closed. Wow, a whole bunch of these little Seths climb up on top of the giant head, but in perfect poses. They're very stylized, but all real. And Seth will explain it, Jane abruptly said, evidently quite surprised. The little images face in all directions around the head of the big Seth. I know it's not right, not a good analogy, but they're like gargoyles on a steeple. It's all very distant now. I never saw the entire giant-sized figure of Seth. The head and the arms were clearest. The whole thing was an immeasurable distance from me. End quote. And after another pause, okay, I think we can have a session now. But until Seth said so, I didn't know he'd explain any of this. Now, give us a moment. Good evening, Seth. Dictation, quietly. Rupert saw the images in a particular fashion so that he could understand certain information about the nature of the psyche. The giant image of myself, never clearly glimpsed by Rupert, represents my own greater reality. In a particular fashion, that identity cannot be fully expressed within the confines of any one form, any more than yours can. Period. Rupert saw many miniature versions of me. In his inner vision, these appeared as identical, simply so that he would identify them as portions of myself. They are actually quite different, one from the others. Each one is involved in its own context of reality, each one pursuing its own directions for its own purposes. One of those Seths was born in your space and time. That Seth then seated himself, so to speak, in the space-time environment you recognize, appearing through the centuries, sending out offshoots of quote-unquote himself, exploring earthly experience, and developing as well as he could those potentials of his own greater identity that could best be brought to fruition within a creature context. Footnote. Quite a few of the diagrams I drew for Jane's Adventures in Consciousness, which is to be published by Prentice Hall in the spring of 1975, illuminate Seth's material in this paragraph. See the opening notes for session 718 of Unknown Reality. End of footnote. It's time for a sip of tea. By the way, everyone, I'm streaming a little bit late tonight due to some schedule anomalies, but I don't know, not too much later than what it has been as of late. I kind of like the variety, actually. The loss of stability is a bit concerning, but the variety is fun, so, whatever. That one Seth was endowed with his own inner blueprint. The blueprint gave him an idea of his potentials and how they could be best fulfilled in earthly terms. Footnote. Wait, it reminds me of in The Nightmare Before Christmas. The Nightmare Before Christmas. Wait, what does? You mean the shirt I'm wearing again? Or something else? Seth discussed his blueprints for reality a number of times in Volume 1 of Unknown Reality. See the 696th session, for instance. Quote, each probability system has its own set of quote-unquote blueprints, clearly defining its freedoms and boundaries. These are not quote-unquote inner images of perfection, and to some extent the blueprints themselves change. As an individual, you carry within you such a blueprint, then. It contains all the information you require to bring about the most favorable version of yourself in the probable system you know. In the same fashion, the species en masse holds within its vast inner mind such working plans or blueprints. End quote. End of footnote. The top hat monster who has the miniature versions of himself hidden beneath his top hat. Oh, I see. With Seth with his like miniature versions and whatnot. Jane's vision of him. I wonder if Seth's consciousness was at all present when they created the Nightmare Before Christmas. Oh boy. Give us a moment. The self, as I've said many times before, is not limited. It can therefore split off from itself without being less. This Seth might be quote-unquote born 2 or 3 times in 1 century, or more, and then in your terms not appear for 5 or 10 centuries. Each Seth would be completely independent, however, and each appearance would signify the creation of a new personality, not simply a new version of an old one. Each would be underlined inherently aware of its own potentials and quote-unquote background, but each would tune into a particular point of that so-called background. What I am saying here applies to the greater identity of each reader. Give us a moment. Because you are usually so worried about preserving what you think of as your identity, we use terms like reincarnational selves or counterparts. If you truly understood the nature of your individuality, however, you would clearly see that there is no contradiction if I say that you are uniquely yourself, that your individuality has an indestructible validity that is never assailed, and when I also say that you are at the same time connected with other identities, each as sacredly inviolate as your own. Yes, exactly. YouTube, for some reason, is removing my comments from chat. That's weird. I had to retype what I meant a few times. Strange. Huh. That is weird. Yeah, I'm just sitting here watching them appear in the chat. Like, they don't seem to be appearing and disappearing on my end. They're just appearing as normal, but that is odd. Never know with YouTube and its glitchiness. Of course, I am currently streaming for the first time from my just finally upgraded to Windows 10 computer, but I highly doubt that would have anything to do with such chat anomalies. But yeah, that's weird. Maybe it's one last guffaw from Mercury in its retrograde shadow still. Who knows? 953. You are used to thinking of exterior organizational patterns. You might live in a city and a state and a country at one time, yet you do not think that your presence in one of these categories contradicts either of the other two. So you live amid psychic organizations, each having its own characteristics. You may consider yourself Indian though you live in America, or American though you live in Africa, or Chinese though you live in France, and you are quite able to retain your sense of individuality. So the psychic families, or the families of consciousness, can be thought of as natives of inner countries of the mind, sharing heritages, purposes, and intents that may have little to do with the physical countries in which you live your surface lives. People are born in any month of the year in every country. All those in Norway are not born in January or August. In the same way, all the members of any given psychic family are spread across the earth, following inner patterns that may or may not relate to other issues as they are currently understood. Certain families have a liking for certain months of birth, but no specific rules apply. Footnote. In Note 3 for Session 734, see my exploration of the months of birth for some of the members of ESP class, many of whom are Samari. End of footnote. There is indeed an inner kind of order that unites all of these issues, yet that inner order is underlined not the result of laws, but of spontaneous creation, which flows into its own kinds of patterns. You see the patterns at any given time and try to make laws of them. I am trying to stretch your imaginations and to help you throw aside rigid concepts that literally blind you to the dimensions of your own reality. Again, you are biologically equipped to perceive far more of that reality than you do. Footnote. In the 685th session for Volume 1, Seth stated that the consciousnesses of ourselves are eternal, and that biologically we're equipped to explore many more probable realities than we know. In the 686th session, he discussed our cells' comprehension of the past, present, and future, as well as our cellular responses to a variety of neurological pulses besides that certain range we're egotistically focused upon. See his first delivery for that session. End of footnote. Give us a moment. A 1-minute pause. You are not a miniature self, an adjunct to some super being, never to share fully in its reality. Long pause. In those terms you underlined are that super self, looking out of only one eye, or using just one finger. Much of this is very difficult to verbalize. Long pause. You are not subordinate to some giant consciousness. While you think in such terms, however, I must speak of reincarnational selves and counterparts, because you are afraid that if you climb out of what you think your identity is, then you will lose it. Take your break. 10:11. I think that in his delivery since 9:53 especially, Seth did a good job of making some important points in a very brief way. Jane's rather intent delivery had slowed noticeably during the last 10 minutes. Boy, she said, I was getting stuff toward the end that neither of us, Seth or me, could verbalize. There wasn't anything in my thought patterns that he could make words out of to express what he wanted to say. I vaguely felt it, but it was pretty alien to my psychological experience. End quote. At the moment, at least, I couldn't recall hearing her voice such ideas just that way before in the sessions. Footnote. But in the appendixes 4 and 5 for Volume 1, see Jane's own material on other than usual neurological pulses or speeds. Seth examined our neurological pulses and habits at 12:19 in session 686. End of footnote. Then, wait, I'm starting to get something on it, Jane suddenly said. He's found something in my thought patterns he can use. She sat with her head down. I'm getting a whole lot of stuff now. I'm embarrassed to say it, she laughed. But I've got the feeling that if I rubbed right here between my eyes, you know, the third eye thing, I could get a lot more information. Footnote. In all of the sessions, Jane has mentioned the third or quote-unquote back eye of occult lore only once before, in session 612 for September 6th, 1972. And she'd been somewhat embarrassed then, too. See the opening excerpts from the 612th session in Appendix 19 with Note 5. In that note, I speculated about, quote, what intuitive knowledge she might possess that led her to talk about, end quote, the third eye at that time. We had the same questions all over again, without intending to investigate them any more now than we did then. End of footnote. Yeah, that's something interesting about Jane and Rob, in case those watching now or in the future haven't noticed by this point, is that, you know, as much as someone like me is into like occult literature and studies of the occult and stuff like that, they don't really consider what they're doing with Seth like a cult at all, actually. They consider it, I guess, well, I mean, as far as I can tell, best of my judgment and abilities to discern it, is they consider it almost a category unto itself, you know, just like it is what it is. They didn't even like being associated with typical psychics, basically. You know, and I think there was a part of Jane in particular that was very resistant, in fact, to the idea of psychics and psychic abilities and psychic functioning, which might have been tied to her Catholic upbringing. I think it was Catholic. But yeah, a little Interesting tidbit right there. Like someone like me, of course, I just walk right in here, like do, and I see this information, and I'm like, I'm sort of coming from it or coming at it from an occult perspective, like student of the occult perspective, but I'm also coming at it from, I guess, a student of spirituality in general perspective. And I also try to come at it from just a purely like open-minded, it is what it is kind of perspective, if that makes sense. Like kind of like what they came at it from. Like it, in a way, it's in a category all unto itself. But I will also, of course, draw connections and parallels of interest where I see them. And we sure have had a couple of those over these sessions, haven't we? Jane didn't rub between her eyes, and without leaving her chair, she went back into the session within a very few minutes. Her eyes were closed. Her delivery was so subdued at first that I wondered if she was using her Seth voice. Resume at 10:15. That's 10:05 as I'm speaking right now. Funny the close proximity of the timestamps tonight. Anyway. Now, we will see if we can express some concepts about the self in a new way. In his own Psychic Politics, Rupert has presented from his psychic library some information concerning official and unofficial numbers. Footnote. We think it quite likely that Seth's material in this delivery, and some of Jane's in Politics, grew out of reading we did earlier this month on quote-unquote new forms of mathematics, which embody some ideas that are actually many centuries old. Involved, however, are very interesting quote-unquote non-standard methods of regarding time, quantum theory, the infinite and the infinitesimal in numbers, model theory, and other mathematical tools. At least as she understands these concepts, Jane and Seth, quote-unquote, took off from them in individual creative ways. For Chapter 19 of Politics, which is to be published in 1976, Jane transcribed from her library, in part, quote, if you imagine the official numbers 1 to 10 in a row, then there would be an infinite number of unofficial ones hidden in the one you saw, and an infinite number of spaces between the official 1 and 2. The position of the 1 on the paper would represent our sense data world, while the invisible ones behind the official 1 would represent the official one's hidden values and infinite probabilities, end quote. And, quote, it's significant that we apply numbers to time, but as there are unrecognized spaces between numbers, there are unrecognized spaces, psychologically invisible, between or within moments, and some of the events of our bodies are quote-unquote too small for us to follow, focused as we are in our prime series. These body events actually are quote-unquote infinitesimal but infinite, following their own patterns that merge with ours, end quote. There are, of course, close relationships concerning this delivery of Seth's for the 740th session, the material in this note, and the musical analogy Seth presented in the 735th session, when he discoursed upon the inaudible variations inherent in the compositions played by the young classical guitarist who visited us over the weekend of February 2nd. I've been saving this reference for this particular note. At 9:45, for instance, in that 735th session, quote, an infinite number of underlined other, quote-unquote, alternate compositions were also laid within the first note, however. They were quite as legitimate as the compositions that underlined were played, and added silent structure and pacing to the physically actualized music, end quote. For the same session, Seth also offered evocative analogies involving heard and unheard musical compositions on the one hand, and counterpart probable and reincarnational selves on the other. End of footnote. Pause, hand to closed eyes. Between each official number in a given series, he envisions literally infinite space. The infinitesimal becomes infinite. Now, eyes open. In the same way, the most infinitesimal self is infinite, and the most finite self, carried to the extremes of itself, is infinite. Each of you is part of an infinite self. That infinite self appears as a series of finite selves in your reality. Beneath that perceived reality, however, each finite self, carried to its degree, is itself infinite. Now here is one for the books, with amusement, underlined. But there are different kinds of infinities. All of that underlined. There are different varieties of psychological infinities that do not meet, that is, that go off in their own infinite directions. Now for a few moments, Jane rubbed in a circular motion between her closed eyes. As long as you believe that as individuals you belong in any given series, you appear to yourselves as finite. You think in terms of linear time, and the best you can do to imagine your deeper reality is to consider reincarnation in time. It is a matter of focus. You usually identify with the outside of yourself and with the outside of the world. You do not, for example, usually identify with the inside of your body, with its organs, much less its cells or atoms. Yet in underlined that direction lies a certain kind of infinity, intently. If you would identify with your own psychological reality, following the inward structure of thoughts and feelings, you would discover an inward psychological infinity. These quote-unquote infinities would reach, of course, into both an infinite past and future. Yet true infinity reaches far beyond past or future, and into all probabilities, not simply straightforward into time or backward. 1029. There is literally an infinity in each moment you recognize, as numerically there is an quote-unquote infinity behind or within any prime number, 397, 863, etc. That's 863, that you recognize. Footnote. For some quotations and references from Volume 1 on the moment point, see Note 11 for Appendix 12. End of footnote. Footnote. In mathematical terms, a prime number is a whole number, not a fraction, for instance, that cannot be exactly divided by any other whole number except itself and 1. End of footnote. Yeah, that's one of the things that I do recall from various math classes in school, is this idea of prime numbers. Numbers that can only be divided by themselves and 1, basically. And this idea, and they even say this in the movie Contact, funny enough, with Jodie Foster. They say that for communication with an extraterrestrial species, you would be searching for well, actually, in the movie itself, they say it's no coincidence that they're using primes, in other words, prime numbers, because mathematics is the only true universal language, which is basically, at least as far as we can tell from our physically focused perspective, accurate, I guess. Here, let's, I don't know, since I find this point particularly fascinating, let's see if we can expand on this a little bit with Google. Hey Google, give me a list of prime numbers. Hey Google, give me a list of prime numbers.
According to the Math Forum, here are the first few prime numbers: 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31, 37, 41, 43, 47, 53,
Oh boy.
59,
This is a long
61,
list.
67,
Oh shit.
71, 73,
Dear God, what have I
79,
done?
83, 89, 97, 101, 103.
Okay, all right, that's enough. So yeah, prime numbers. See, who says that you don't ever learn any kind of like more conventional knowledge from my streams? There you go, fucking prime numbers. Also, as long as we're taking a little intermission here, I'm gonna turn my heater down a little bit. It's getting a little warm in here. Okay. All right, let us resume. There are infinite versions of yourself, but no one negates the others, and each is connected with the others and aids and supports them. There are other quite legitimate numerical systems that you do not follow. There are other kinds of psychological organizations also. In those terms, Rupert has learned, or rather Rupert underlined is learning, to alternate a series, to bring information from one neurological series to another, so to speak. That was great. I'm glad you like it, or liked it. Thank you very much. I like to occasionally have a little fun with the information that we come across when possible. However, none of this is apart from normal living. Whether or not they want to mention it here in unknown reality, both Rupert and Joseph have learned to correlate data so that some of the implications involved in a simple move from one house to another become apparent. Wait a minute, Seth. What are you talking about? Whether or not they want to mention it here in unknown reality? Seth, don't you know by now that they mention literally everything that you say in their books or in your books that they're transcribing at that time, except for very personal material? Don't you get that by now, Seth? I don't know. Anyway. They are not mathematicians. They will not statistically analyze the results. Yet I tell you that the moves that you make in daily life have indeed infinite effects, and I am not using the word loosely. Now take your break. 10:36. Wow, Jane exclaimed as she emerged from her short but excellent delivery. Before the session, I didn't feel a thing. I was just sort of happily dopey, no ideas at all. But I really clicked in before this break. Seth finally found something he could use to make analogies. I wasn't aware of traffic noise or anything else. The whole thing surprises me. Look what I'd have missed if I decided not to have a session. And I didn't know Seth was going to explain those visions until I got that flash from him just before he came through. I have the feeling that inside that experience I traveled a great distance, end quote. Concerning Seth's remark about, quote, a simple move from one house to another, for Jane and me, this includes all of the other people involved too. In the previous 5 sessions, I've inserted just enough quote-unquote house connections to indicate what's been materializing for us in this area, without digressing to write a much longer history. Our list of such interrelationships contains over 40 items so far, and continues to grow. However, many of these are made up of several related events, figures, etc., and so could be legitimately divided further if we chose to do so. Footnote. This house connection is a good example of the kind that's not only made up of a number of related elements, but extends over a longer period of time. Because of those combined attributes, I'm adding this note to the 740th session in October 1975, 6 months after Seth finished dictating Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. All names have been changed. In Note 1 for Session 739, I wrote that when Jane and I decided to buy the Hill House on February 21st, 1975, we learned that the place next to it on the west would soon be for sale. I also commented that it would, quote, be interesting to see what, if any, house connections develop, end quote. Not long after we moved into the Hill House in March, our new acquaintance and next-door neighbor to the east, Frank Corio, told us he knows Louise Akins. She was one of the first students to attend Jane's ESP class in September 1967. An interesting tidbit, we thought. considering that Elmira is a city of close to 50,000 people, and in turn is surrounded by a similar number residing in smaller communities. I added Frank's information to our list of house connections, then forgot about it. Frank is also in real estate, although he has no professional associations with the Johnsons, Debbie, or the agency through which we bought the Hill House. The house west of us became vacant this year in early summer. In the fall, Frank Corio was given the job of selling the place and soon did so to a family, the Millers, who were moving to Elmira from a distant state. Next, Jane and I found out from Mrs. Miller that she, too, knows Louise Atkins. The odds against such a quote-unquote coincidence developing would be astronomical, except that the Millers had lived in a neighborhood close to the Hill House several years ago, when the acquaintanceship with Louise Atkins had been made, had moved out of state, then returned to buy the house next door to us. The house connection is still unique, however, considering that in the Hill House, Jane and I found ourselves bracketed east and west by people who knew one of her early students, who had in turn mentioned Jane to them. Interesting that Frank Corio had been instrumental in bringing the Millers back to their favorite neighborhood, when in a city the size of Elmira, there are at any time a number of homes for sale in quote-unquote desirable neighborhoods, including quote-unquote ours. Jane and I certainly don't think the fact that Frank and Mrs. Miller know Louise Atkins was the reason the Millers moved next door to us, yet it is one factor to be considered among a myriad of others: money, availability, and so forth. Why did Jane and I move into a neighborhood in which such a house connection could develop to begin with? Why was Frank Corio assigned the task of selling the house next door to us? Why did the Millers encounter him at just that particular time? And why was he, of all the real estate agents in Elmira, the one who succeeded in selling them the house they bought? Such connections and questions, whatever their strength and the conscious or unconscious motivations behind them, make a fascinating area for study. Once again, we were reminded of Seth's material at 11:25 for the 737th session, when he told us that, quote, movers are in league with each other, end quote. In concluding this note, I should add that our neighbor, Frank Corio, was involved in other house connections with Jane and me, some of them quite as intriguing as the one just described. End of footnote. Geez, all this house stuff being described in these recent sessions. I don't know, you guys. I don't really find the house stuff that fascinating, but maybe that's just me. Like, I don't know. It almost feels like something of a distraction from Seth's deeper, more interesting material, but it is included nonetheless. Jane and I do not ascribe the elements making up our house adventures to that old catch-all coincidence, of course. At the same time, we have no plans to statistically attempt anything with them either. So many variables are present that a separate analysis would be required for each individual involved, with quote-unquote boundaries, say, set as to the number of items to be considered in each case. Then what about temporal boundaries? Truly, for myself, the whole house thing had its origins in my early childhood, over half a century ago. But Jane, being younger, would designate quite different limitations in time. A query. With the individual analyses done, would it be possible to incorporate them all into one master work? Such a project would be a formidable one, I think, and would take at least a book in itself. I'm just waiting, Jane said finally, after we'd each had a little something to eat. I feel unsettled. I think there's another bunch of material there. Seth's going to get it if I can do it, if he can find some more thought patterns he can use, end quote. A long pause. Now I'll try. All right, I'm going to take this opportunity before the session sort of resumes to grab a tissue, because I feel like I'm going to sneeze at any moment if I do not. So one moment, please. Alright, I am back with a vengeance. But yeah, all this like house and like neighborhood material, I don't know about this stuff. It's maybe a little interesting, but I'm much more into Seth's other stuff, which, as I mentioned before, by the way, I know, you see, I haven't read The Unknown Reality prior to these streams. I'm like reading it for the first time as I'm reading it to all of you and like analyzing it. But I have read the next several books after this one, and I can tell you for a fact that they overall are quite interesting, especially the next like 2 books, I believe, The Nature of the Psyche, and then I think the next one is called The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events. So when we get to those, I guarantee that, at least if you're anything like me, you'll find it quite interesting. Even if some of the stuff in The Unknown Reality seems almost too damn extraneous. But I don't know. Whatever. We're still going to go through it. We're still going to complete it. Very quietly at 11:06. Imagine a string of different colored Christmas tree lights, all glowing on a given tree. In this series of lights, any one light can go out while the others continue to shine. You are familiar with that arrangement. However, in our imaginary assortment, there are many such strings, and when a light goes out on one string, quote unquote, it almost automatically appears on another string. Now, generally speaking, the lights are all lit at once on any given string, except for those that now and then go out. Pretend that you are very tiny and moving slowly about the tree so that you see only one light at a time. It appears that one light exists before the other, then, and each one is so brilliant to your focus that it blots out the lights before and after it. You may have a dim memory of the light you quote-unquote saw before, however, and so you think, aha, the bulb I see is my life, but I'm sure that long ago I had a different life, and perhaps another one lies ahead of me. But unless you step far back from the tree, you will not realize that the entire string of lights exists at once. Nor will you understand that when one light goes out in a strand, it appears somewhere else on the tree in another strand. If you were still tinier, then any given bulb itself might seem to emit not a steady light at all, but a series of waves, and you might identify your life with any given wave, so that great distance might be perceived between one wave and the next. Footnote. Seth's ideas in this paragraph and the one just preceding it are consistent with his material in a number of sessions for Volume 1. In sessions 681 and 684, for instance, he discussed the on-off fluctuations of our physical universe and everything within it, moment points, probabilities, Jane sensations of massiveness, the basic unpredictable motion of any wave or atom, and much more. In sessions 682 through 83, he stressed the nature of his CUs, or units of consciousness. Then in Volume 2, Seth likened his own identity to that of a wave formation. See the excerpts from the 775th session in Appendix 18 with Note 35. I also think his use of great distance this evening, just before 11:20, is somehow related to the feeling of immeasurable distance that Jane experienced in her vision as she sat for the session. End of footnote. So I'm gonna take a little intermission here. My lips feel like they need lip balm, and my voice and like throat feels like it needs more tea, so guess I better take care of that real quick. The fun of doing stuff like this live. Okay, well now I'm out of tea, so hopefully I don't need any more for the rest of the stream. Pause at 11:20. Experiencing that kind of series could lead to entirely different kinds of perception, in which infinities, pause, existed, pause, within a scale of its own. In parentheses, the series would have its own kind of infinite underlined t's. Infinite t's. A singular its, but a plural infinities? I asked. Jane, as Seth, nodded in agreement. A tree could be wired with lights, with each one having its own particular series of waves. The people who put up the tree might experience one Christmas Eve, while other consciousnesses, tuned into the different series, could experience endless generations, and underlined their perceptions would be quite as legitimate as those of the light watchers who had erected the tree. Footnote. In retrospect, we can see how the mystical Jane has always tried to intuitively penetrate the nature of reality through her art. I've illustrated that learning process by presenting selections from her early poetry at apropos times throughout the 2 volumes of Unknown Reality. I also gave some background information on Jane's nature with a poem in Appendix 1 for Volume 1. One of those steps in Jane's self-directed search for understanding is referred to in Note 5 for Session 681 in Volume 1, which contains 3 lines from her poem, More Than Men. She wrote it in 1954, when she was 25 years old. That was the year we married. A second house perfection year of money, values, and close one-on-one interpersonal relationships. Fascinating. The Seth material's inception lay 9 years ahead of us. Neither of us knew what mediumship was. Yet, as Jane said recently, it was there in the poetry all the time, only I didn't understand. Now I want to offer that poem in full. And that's back to Rob, like, sort of narrating the notes or whatever when he says, now I want to offer that poem in full. More than men. More than men have walked these shores in twilight. More gods than ours have risen altars fair. The earth is filled with songs not of our singing. There are worlds about us in which we have no share. Between each ticking of the clock, long centuries pass, in universes hidden from our own, and our time's eons are far less than breath, or the flight of a leaf by the wind blown. End of poem. End of footnote. This is not necessarily the best analogy, but I wanted to make the point that various scales of awareness contain their own infinities, no matter how finite they may appear to be. The soul, so-called, is not related to size or duration in space and time, except insofar as it is wedded to experience within those contexts. Give us a moment. That will be the end of dictation. Take a break or end the session as you prefer. We'll take the break and see what happens. 11:29 p.m. That's as far as we can carry it tonight, Jane said, meaning book material. She wasn't so sure about ending the session itself. We sat waiting. 5 minutes later, she said, well, I guess that's it. And the session was over. All right, so indeed, that is the end of that session. And let's see, we've been going for nearly an hour and 15 minutes now. So I think that is indeed where we shall wrap it up after 2 sessions as usual. But so let me make some observations and give a little preview as usual of the subject matter we will cover next week in these sessions. And then might have a couple other closing remarks to make. Let us see. So here we are with, what the hell is it again? Session 741, okay. All right, here it is, the preview. Session 741, how you move through probabilities, predictions, and probable acts, the prime series of events. Session 742, the end of the world and probabilities, Lannis, a new era for man. Well, that does sound fascinating. And then after that, there's literally just 2 more sessions, and it's the end of the main part of the book. And then we just have the appendix. So finally, after what feels like forever, doing these streams analyzing the unknown reality, volumes 1 and 2, we're finally sort of getting to the end. But here's the thing. When we factor in the appendix material, we are still like a long way from the end of the book. It's still, when I look at the I don't know, timeline or whatever on my screen, it still looks like we're only 2/3 the way there in volume 2. We're only 2/3 through volume 2, and this is literally part 20. After 20 of these like streaming sessions, we're still only 2/3. So I guess there will most likely end up being about 30 parts to this entirely. That's crazy, but that's okay. I'm not complaining. I like the abundance of information. It's just pretty wild. Which, if that's true, here, if you want to click off of this now, if you're watching it after the fact, or even if you're watching it live, that's fine. I don't care. But I just want to see real quick, while we're still live, if that's true, as I look at my Windows 10 calendar here, when would we be most likely to finish our analysis of the Unknown Reality Volume 2? So I'm just going to count on screen here until I figure it out. So let's see. This was part 20. In a week, it'll be 21, then 22, 23, 24, 25 on January 6th. And then 26, 27, 28, 29 on February 3rd. And then on February 10th of 2020, we may finally finish our analysis of the Unknown Reality Volume 2. Or around that time, we should theoretically. Maybe a little bit later. But yeah. So, geez. Like, we'll literally be in the next decade, in a way, by the time we finally finish this book. It's a very long book. Anyway, that's fine. So I want to thank everyone who has been watching this for watching this. I greatly appreciate it. Again, I know, like, if you're feeling like this house material and stuff that Seth has been going over isn't that interesting, I'm kind of right there with you. Like, I'm not really that interested in it myself, and I'm just going over all of it to be thorough. But I can guarantee you, while I haven't read the rest of the Unknown Reality Volume 2, I have read the next like few Seth books that we'll be reading, and I remember distinctly the next like 1 or 2 at least being very interesting. Like, it definitely gets back to what I think is much more interesting material in the next at least 1 or 2 Seth books. So I know it probably won't be until February that we get to those, but still, you know, it's coming eventually, as long as nothing stops me from doing these streams in the meantime. So anyway, yeah, thanks again for being here. I think I'm gonna make a couple personal remarks and updates for those who are interested after this. But if you're not interested in that, feel free to click off of this now, or or like if you're watching after the fact, click off of it. It's fine. Totally understand. Not everyone's interested in that stuff. But yeah, I want to thank those for watching this, who have been here and who watched this after the fact. I appreciate the support. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And I hope you had a happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate Thanksgiving. Anyway, here's my little tidbit of information though. So it's just funny. Earlier today, of course, I had yet another therapy appointment, and actually this ties into these Seth streams in a way. This wasn't at all planned, but I ended up excuse me, I'm just like clearing my throat here. I ended up like ranting to my therapist, and I tweeted about this too, about what I said on Twitter, what I called the wretchedness of pure positive focus philosophy. And so I was like ranting about this, and he was like, so who does this really come from? And I said, well, there's a number of sort of new agey people that it comes from, but for me, it was primarily Abraham Hicks, and with like Esther Hicks and her husband Jerry before he died, and proceeded to talk about that a little bit. And then my therapist told me that he looked up Abraham Hicks and Esther and Jerry Hicks after I had mentioned them in previous sessions, and he said he read a brief article on them. And so I just thought, dear God, what have I done? My therapist literally looked these people up, but that's good though, I guess. But then I proceeded to tell him, like, to talk to him more about it, and just sort of going on a rant about the problems with pure positive focus philosophy. And it was kind of funny in a way, because I ended up sort of delivering this like damning indictment of these apparently 11th dimensional entities. I said to my therapist, I was like, look, I'm not going to sit here and say that I know for sure that these entities / this entity of Abraham is even real. I don't know if Abraham is a real, like, otherworldly entity, but if it is, or if they are, or whatever, I would suspect that Abraham is most likely of the 11th dimensional angelic realms. And then I started to criticize them because to the best of my knowledge, they are quite unaware of the realities of physical life here on Earth for us humans. And so then I was literally criticizing 11th dimensional angelic beings for their lack of knowledge about 3D or third dimensional reality, physical reality, to my therapist. So he must have a lot of fun when he has me as a patient, I guess, or a client or whatever. Anyway, I just want to throw that little tidbit in there. Other than that, for those who have kept up with that situation, I had a rather cordial exchange with him, and I don't know. My life is, it's up and then it's down. It's like, and I have to even choose my words carefully here, because I've explained this before, but like, if I say that sometimes things are getting better, then people will take that to mean, oh, things are getting better, so there must no longer be very severe injustices or other issues that I am deeply upset about. And it's like, no, bitch. There are indeed very severe injustices and issues that I remain deeply upset about, and that I have been, I would say, increasingly angry about in recent times. And I hope to share some of them in the near future, whether on streams through this channel, or maybe through some videos on my other sort of experimental channel, Neurotic Navigations, which there's a link to on my channel page if you're curious about that. But on that note, I will say that this Wednesday I am planning on most likely doing a special stream on one of these issues. I'm not quite sure which yet, but if things go according to plan for me, this Wednesday might make for quite the explosive live stream for me. Hopefully it will, and I will. I don't know. Continue in my very humble way, I guess, with my small group of people that actually do watch me, which I'm honored by, to deliver the fight to the enemy, the fight against invalidation, the fight against injustice, as I see it, and enjoy that a lot as well. I recently added to my Twitter, spiritual soldier in the war against invalidation. So that's what it is, I guess. Anyway, but no, seriously, sincerely, thank you to those who do watch me. Appreciate the support. That's just, it's an honor, really, that you watch me and listen to what I have to say and my analysis of whether it's the Seth material or whatever it is. Just, thank you so much. That's so great. Anyway, again, I hope that you all have a great night. I'm going to get going now. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy belated Thanksgiving to those who celebrated that. And hope to see you on Wednesday. Thanks again for watching, and bye for now.